Margaret Williams had worked as a housekeeper for wealthy families for over 30 years, but nothing had prepared her for what she would encounter at the Henderson mansion. At 62 years old, with graying hair always pulled back in a neat bun and hands that showed the wear of decades of honest work, Margaret had seen it all. She had cleaned up after spoiled children, managed households during family scandals, and kept secrets that could destroy reputations. But the mystery surrounding Jonathan Henderson would test everything she knew about life, medicine, and the power of observation. Jonathan Henderson was not just wealthy, he was impossibly rich. At 45 years old, he had built a technology empire that spanned 3 continents. His company developed software that powered half the world's smartphones, and his personal fortune was estimated at over $12 billion. He owned mansions in 7 countries, a private jet that cost more than most people's lifetime earnings, and art collections that museums could only dream of acquiring. Yet despite all his wealth and power, Jonathan Henderson was dying, and nobody could figure out why. The mansion where Margaret worked stood on a hill overlooking the Pacific Ocean in Malibu, California. The house itself was a masterpiece of modern architecture, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered breathtaking views of the coastline. Every room was decorated with priceless art and furniture that had been featured in architectural magazines. The kitchen alone was larger than most people's entire homes, equipped with professional-grade appliances and marble countertops that gleamed under crystal chandeliers. Margaret had been hired 6 months earlier when Jonathan's condition first began to deteriorate. His previous housekeeper, a woman named Rosa who had worked for the family for 15 years, had quit suddenly. The family never explained why Rosa left, but Margaret heard whispers from the gardener that Rosa had become frightened of something in the house. Margaret needed the job, the pay was excellent, and her own medical bills were mounting, so she didn't ask too many questions. When Margaret first met Jonathan Henderson, she was struck by how normal he seemed despite his enormous wealth. Unlike many rich people she had worked for, he was polite to the staff, remembered their names, and often asked about their families. He was a tall man with dark hair that was beginning to show silver at the temples, and he had the kind of confident bearing that came from years of making decisions that affected thousands of people. But even in those early days, Margaret noticed something troubling in his eyes, a weariness that went deeper than simple fatigue. The first signs of Jonathan's illness had appeared 8 months before Margaret arrived. It started with headaches that he dismissed as stress from a major business deal. Jonathan was known for his incredible work ethic, often putting in 16-hour days and flying around the world to manage his various business interests. His assistant, Patricia Morrison, had worked with him for over a decade and was used to his demanding schedule. But she began to worry when the headaches became constant and Jonathan started having trouble concentrating during important meetings. Within weeks, the headaches were accompanied by dizzy spells that left Jonathan gripping the edges of tables to steady himself. His wife, Eleanor, a former model who had married Jonathan 15 years earlier, initially assumed he was just overworked. She encouraged him to take a vacation, suggesting they visit their villa in Tuscany or their penthouse in Manhattan. But Jonathan refused to slow down, insisting that a major competitor was trying to steal one of his biggest clients, and that he couldn't afford to appear weak. The situation became impossible to ignore when Jonathan collapsed during a board meeting. He had been presenting quarterly earnings to his company's directors when he suddenly stopped mid-sentence, swayed on his feet, and crashed to the conference room floor. The paramedics who responded found his blood pressure dangerously low and his pulse irregular. They rushed him to Cedars-Sinai Medical Center, one of the most prestigious hospitals in Los Angeles, where a team of emergency doctors worked to stabilize his condition. Dr. Michael Chun, the emergency room physician who first treated Jonathan, was baffled by his symptoms. Jonathan's blood tests showed nothing obviously wrong. His cholesterol was normal, his blood sugar was stable, and there were no signs of infection. His heart appeared healthy on the EKG, and a CT scan of his brain revealed no obvious abnormalities. Yet Jonathan was clearly suffering from something serious. He complained of severe fatigue, nausea that made it difficult to eat, and a strange metallic taste in his mouth that never went away. Eleanor spared no expense in seeking answers for her husband's condition. She hired Dr. Sarah Williams, one of the top neurologists on the West Coast, to conduct a comprehensive examination. Dr. Williams was known for her ability to diagnose rare conditions that other doctors missed. She had trained at Johns Hopkins and Harvard, published numerous research papers, and had successfully treated celebrities and politicians whose cases had stumped other physicians. Dr. Williams put Jonathan through an extensive battery of tests. She ordered MRIs of his brain and spine, looking for tumors or other abnormalities that might explain his symptoms. She conducted nerve conduction studies to check for neurological damage and arranged for spinal taps to test his cerebrospinal fluid for signs of infection or inflammation. She tested his blood for rare autoimmune diseases and genetic disorders that might cause his constellation of symptoms. When Dr. Williams' tests came back negative, Eleanor sought a second opinion from Dr. Robert Martinez, a world-renowned internist who had written textbooks on diagnostic medicine. Dr. Martinez approached Jonathan's case from a different angle, focusing on potential environmental causes or rare infectious diseases. He tested Jonathan's blood for heavy metal poisoning, exotic parasites, and obscure viral infections that might have been contracted during his extensive international travel. Dr. Martinez's tests also came back normal, which only deepened the mystery. By this time, Jonathan's condition had worsened significantly. He had lost over 30 pounds, his once sharp mind was clouded by constant brain fog, and he spent most of his days in bed, too weak to manage his business empire. His assistant Patricia had to cancel important meetings, and his company's stock price began to fluctuate as rumors spread about the CEO's health.
Here, look at these readings
now. Desperate for answers, Eleanor expanded the search for medical help. She flew in Dr. Amanda Foster from the Mayo Clinic, a specialist in rare diseases who had a reputation for solving medical mysteries that stumped other physicians. Dr. Foster spent 2 weeks examining Jonathan, reviewing all his previous test results, and conducting additional studies. She brought in specialists in tropical medicine, toxicology, and even genetic counseling, thinking that Jonathan might have a hereditary condition that had remained dormant until now. Dr. Foster's team was thorough and methodical, but they too came up empty-handed. Jonathan's symptoms didn't fit any known disease pattern, and his test results continued to show nothing definitively wrong. The doctors began to whisper among themselves about the possibility that Jonathan's illness might be psychological. Perhaps the stress of running a massive corporation had finally taken its toll on his mental health. This suggestion infuriated Eleanor, who knew her husband better than anyone. Jonathan had always been mentally tough, capable of handling enormous pressure without breaking down. She refused to accept that his illness was all in his head and continued her search for medical answers. She contacted medical centers around the world, from the Cleveland Clinic to specialized hospitals in Switzerland and Japan. As word of Jonathan's mysterious illness spread through the medical community, more specialists became involved in his case. Dr. Jennifer Liu, an infectious disease expert from UCSF, flew down to examine Jonathan after hearing about his case at a medical conference. She was particularly interested in the possibility that Jonathan had contracted a rare infection during his business trips to developing countries. Dr. Liu's investigation revealed that Jonathan had indeed traveled extensively in the months before his illness began. He had visited manufacturing facilities in Vietnam, attended conferences in Mumbai, and negotiated deals in several African countries where his company was expanding its operations. Dr. Liu tested Jonathan's blood for dozens of rare parasites and bacterial infections that were common in those regions, but every test came back negative. The parade of medical experts continued as Eleanor's desperation grew. She brought in Dr. Thomas Wright, a cardiologist who specialized in rare heart conditions that might not show up on standard tests. Dr. Wright suspected that Jonathan might have a subtle heart rhythm disorder that was affecting blood flow to his brain and other organs. He fitted Jonathan with sophisticated monitoring devices and had him wear them for weeks, recording every heartbeat to look for abnormalities. Dr. Wright's monitoring revealed that Jonathan's heart was indeed skipping beats occasionally, but not enough to explain the severity of his symptoms. The cardiologist prescribed medication to regulate Jonathan's heart rhythm, hoping it might provide some relief. For a few days, Jonathan seemed slightly better, and Eleanor allowed herself to hope that they had finally found the answer. But the improvement was temporary, and within a week, Jonathan was back to spending most of his time in bed, unable to concentrate or eat properly. Margaret watched all of this unfold during her first few months working in the Henderson household. She had been hired not just to clean but to help care for Jonathan as his condition worsened. This meant preparing special meals that he might be able to keep down, organizing his medications, and making sure his bedroom was comfortable as he spent increasingly long periods confined to bed. What struck Margaret most about the situation was how systematic and thorough the doctors were, yet how frustrated they all seemed. She had worked in households where family members were seriously ill, and she had seen doctors struggle with difficult diagnoses before. But she had never witnessed such a parade of medical experts, all highly credentialed and confident, who seemed genuinely baffled by a patient's condition. Margaret also noticed details that the doctors seemed to overlook. As someone who cleaned every room in the house thoroughly, she was intimately familiar with the Henderson family's daily routines, their habits, and the small changes that might escape notice. She observed that Jonathan's symptoms seemed to follow certain patterns. He was always worse in the morning, seemed to improve slightly in the afternoon, and then felt terrible again by evening. She also noticed that Jonathan's condition seemed to worsen after he spent time in certain parts of the house. He often worked in his home office, a beautiful room on the second floor that overlooked the ocean. The office was decorated with expensive artwork and furnished with a custom-made mahogany desk that had cost more than most people's cars. Jonathan loved this room and had spent countless hours there building his business empire. But Margaret began to notice that he always seemed particularly sick after spending extended periods in the office. The medical mystery deepened when Dr. Elizabeth Santos, a renowned toxicologist from Harvard Medical School, joined the team trying to diagnose Jonathan's condition. Dr. Santos was an expert in environmental poisoning and had helped solve several high-profile cases where people had been sickened by exposure to unusual toxins. Eleanor had contacted her after reading about a case where Dr. Santos had identified a rare industrial chemical that had been making an entire family sick. Dr. Santos approached Jonathan's case with a detective's mindset, looking for potential sources of toxic exposure in his environment. She tested the air quality in the Henderson mansion, checked the water supply, and analyzed samples of food from the kitchen. She was particularly interested in Jonathan's office, since he spent so much time there, and she arranged for extensive testing of everything from the carpet to the paint on the walls. The toxicology tests revealed traces of various chemicals that were common in modern homes, cleaning products, furniture treatments, and painting materials, but nothing at levels that would be considered dangerous. Dr. Santos was puzzled, but not discouraged. She had seen cases where people had unusual sensitivities to chemicals that wouldn't affect most people, and she continued to investigate potential environmental causes. Meanwhile, Jonathan's condition continued to deteriorate. His weight loss became more pronounced, and his skin took on a grayish pallor that alarmed everyone who saw him. His once thick hair began to thin noticeably, and his fingernails became brittle and discolored. Eleanor barely left his side, sleeping in a chair next to their bed and monitoring every change in his condition. The emotional toll on the family was enormous. Eleanor, who had always been poised and confident, began to show signs of severe stress. She lost weight herself, developed dark circles under her eyes, and snapped at staff members over minor issues. Jonathan's teenage daughter from his first marriage, Ashley, came to visit from boarding school and was shocked by her father's appearance. The vibrant, energetic man who had taught her to ride horses and taken her on adventures around the world was now a shadow of his former self. As Margaret continued to work in the household, she began to pay closer attention to the details that surrounded Jonathan's daily life. She noticed that his symptoms seemed to correlate with certain activities and locations within the house. She also observed that some of the medical equipment that had been brought in to monitor Jonathan's condition was producing readings that the doctors found puzzling and inconsistent. Margaret had always been an observant person. It was a skill that had served her well in her work as a housekeeper. Wealthy families often had secrets, and successful domestic workers learned to see everything while appearing to notice nothing. But in Jonathan's case, Margaret felt a genuine concern that went beyond professional duty. She liked Jonathan and his family, and she was troubled by the suffering she witnessed every day. The ninth doctor to examine Jonathan was Dr. Patricia Kumar, an endocrinologist who specialized in hormone disorders. Dr. Kumar suspected that Jonathan might have a rare condition affecting his adrenal glands or thyroid that was causing his symptoms. She conducted extensive hormone testing and even arranged for Jonathan to undergo a nuclear medicine scan that could detect subtle abnormalities in his endocrine system. Dr. Kumar's tests revealed some minor hormone imbalances, but nothing dramatic enough to explain Jonathan's severe symptoms. She prescribed hormone replacement therapy, hoping it might help restore some of his energy and mental clarity. The treatment provided minimal improvement, and Dr. Kumar admitted that she was as baffled as her colleagues by Jonathan's condition. By this time, Jonathan's case had become something of a legend in medical circles. Doctors at major medical centers knew about the billionaire whose illness had stumped some of the best physicians in the country. Medical students were discussing his case in classes, and some researchers began to wonder if Jonathan might have a completely new disease that had never been identified before. The 10th doctor was Dr. Rachel Green, a psychiatrist who specialized in the connection between mental health and physical symptoms. Eleanor was reluctant to consult a psychiatrist, still refusing to believe that Jonathan's illness was psychological, but Dr. Green came highly recommended as someone who could identify subtle mental health issues that might manifest as physical symptoms. Dr. Green spent hours interviewing Jonathan about his stress levels, his relationships, and his emotional state in the months before his illness began. She also interviewed Eleanor, Patricia, and other family members to get a complete picture of Jonathan's mental health. Her assessment revealed that while Jonathan was indeed under significant business pressure, he showed no signs of depression, anxiety, or other mental health conditions that might cause such severe physical symptoms. As the medical mystery continued, Margaret found herself paying more attention to conversations between the doctors and family members. She overheard discussions about experimental treatments, consultations with medical experts in other countries, and even the possibility of taking Jonathan to specialized medical centers overseas. The desperation in Eleanor's voice was heartbreaking, and Margaret wished there was something she could do to help. The 11th and 12th doctors were specialists in rare genetic disorders who wondered if Jonathan might have a hereditary condition that had remained dormant until triggered by some unknown factor. They conducted extensive genetic testing, looking for mutations that might cause his constellation of symptoms. The testing took weeks to complete and cost tens of thousands of dollars, but the results were once again normal. Dr. Mark Stevens, the 13th physician to examine Jonathan, was a specialist in environmental medicine who focused specifically on illnesses caused by exposure to mold and other biological contaminants. Dr. Stevens had seen cases where people became seriously ill from exposure to toxic mold that was hidden in their homes, and he suspected this might be the cause of Jonathan's symptoms. Dr. Stevens arranged for comprehensive mold testing throughout the Henderson mansion. His team took air samples, tested surfaces for mold spores, and even cut into walls to check for hidden mold growth. They found small amounts of mold that were typical for coastal homes, but nothing that would be considered dangerous or likely to cause serious illness. The 14th doctor was Dr. Lisa Park, a specialist in autoimmune diseases who thought Jonathan might have a rare condition where his immune system was attacking his own body in subtle ways that didn't show up on standard tests. She conducted specialized testing for unusual autoimmune markers and even arranged for Jonathan to undergo experimental treatments that might calm an overactive immune system. Dr. Park's treatments seemed to provide some temporary relief, and for a few weeks, Jonathan showed signs of improvement. His energy increased slightly, and his mental fog seemed to clear a bit. Eleanor was hopeful that they had finally found the answer, and she began making plans for Jonathan's recovery. But, once again, the improvement was short-lived, and Jonathan soon returned to his previous state of illness. The 15th doctor arrived on a foggy Tuesday morning in November, nearly 8 months after Jonathan Henderson first collapsed in his conference room. Dr. James Morrison was a world-renowned specialist in rare diseases who had been flown in from the London School of Tropical Medicine. His reputation preceded him. He had identified obscure illnesses in patients that other doctors had given up on, and his diagnostic skills were legendary in medical circles around the world. Margaret Williams watched from the kitchen window as Dr. Morrison's black sedan pulled up the circular driveway of the Henderson mansion. She had seen so many medical experts come and go over the past 6 months that she had stopped feeling hopeful when new doctors arrived. Each specialist had seemed confident at first, armed with theories and testing protocols that surely would solve the mystery of Jonathan's illness. But, one by one, they had all left the mansion looking frustrated and defeated. Dr. Morrison was a tall, distinguished man in his 60s with silver hair and the kind of authoritative bearing that came from decades of solving medical mysteries. He carried an old-fashioned leather medical bag and wore a perfectly tailored suit that spoke of success and confidence. As Margaret watched him walk toward the front door, she wondered if this doctor would be different from all the others, or if he too would eventually join the growing list of specialists who couldn't explain what was killing Jonathan Henderson. Eleanor Henderson greeted Dr. Morrison at the door, her face showing the strain of months of worry and sleepless nights. She had lost nearly 20 pounds since her husband's illness began, and her once perfect appearance now showed signs of the stress she was under. Her designer clothes hung loosely on her frame, and her usually immaculate hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail that suggested she had more important things to worry about than her appearance. "Dr. Morrison, thank you so much for coming," Eleanor said, her voice carrying a mixture of hope and desperation that Margaret had heard many times before. "I've read about your work with rare tropical diseases, and I'm hoping you can see something that the other doctors missed. My husband traveled extensively in the months before he became ill, and several doctors have suggested he might have contracted something unusual during his trips." Dr. Morrison nodded gravely as he followed Eleanor through the mansion's elegant foyer toward the main staircase. "I've reviewed your husband's medical records, Mrs. Henderson, and I must say this is one of the most puzzling cases I've encountered. The symptom pattern is unusual, and the fact that so many qualified physicians have been unable to reach a diagnosis suggests we may be dealing with something quite rare indeed." Margaret followed discreetly behind, carrying a tray of tea and fresh fruit that she had prepared for the doctor's visit. Part of her job was to anticipate the needs of visitors and to remain available but unobtrusive during important meetings. Over the months of caring for Jonathan, she had become skilled at moving quietly through the house while staying close enough to help if needed. Jonathan was propped up in bed when they entered the master bedroom, looking far older than his 45 years. His face had become gaunt, his cheeks hollow, and his once bright eyes now seemed dulled by constant fatigue and pain. The expensive silk pajamas he wore hung loosely on his diminished frame, and his hands trembled slightly as he tried to sit up straighter to greet the new doctor. "Mr. Henderson, I'm Dr. Morrison," the physician said, approaching the bed with the confident manner of someone accustomed to dealing with difficult cases. "I understand you've been quite ill, and I'm here to see if I can help figure out what's been making you feel so terrible. I'd like to start by asking you some questions about your symptoms and your travels in the months before you became sick." Margaret set the tea tray on a side table and began to quietly organize Jonathan's medications while listening to the conversation. She had heard similar interviews many times before, but she always paid attention, hoping to catch some detail that might be important. Over the months of caring for Jonathan, she had developed a deep concern for his well-being that went beyond her professional duties. Dr. Morrison's questioning was thorough and methodical. He asked about every trip Jonathan had taken in the year before his illness began, inquiring about specific countries visited, accommodations used, foods consumed, and activities undertaken. He was particularly interested in Jonathan's business trips to Vietnam, India, and several countries in sub-Saharan Africa, regions known for harboring unusual parasites and infections that rarely appeared in Western countries. "Tell me about your accommodations during these trips," Dr. Morrison said, making notes in a small leather notebook. "Did you stay in international hotels, or did you ever find yourself in more remote locations where sanitation might have been questionable?" Jonathan struggled to concentrate as he answered, his voice weak and sometimes trailing off mid-sentence. "Mostly 5-star hotels, he said slowly. But in Vietnam, I visited a manufacturing facility that was quite remote. We stayed overnight in a small town there, and the hotel wasn't up to international standards. The water tasted strange, and there were insects everywhere. Eleanor leaned forward, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Several doctors have tested Jonathan for tropical diseases, but everything has come back negative. Could he have something that doesn't show up on standard tests? Dr. Morrison nodded thoughtfully. There are indeed some parasites and infections that can be difficult to detect with conventional testing. Some require very specific tests that aren't routinely performed, and others go through dormant phases where they're nearly impossible to identify. I'd like to arrange for some specialized testing that focuses specifically on organisms found in Southeast Asia and Africa. Margaret continued to work quietly in the room, but her attention was caught by something Dr. Morrison had mentioned. She thought about the timeline of Jonathan's illness and tried to remember exactly when his first symptoms had appeared. She had a good memory for dates and details. It was a skill that served her well in managing household schedules and keeping track of important events. As she recalled, Jonathan's first headaches had begun in late February, nearly 3 months after his last business trip to Vietnam. Margaret had always been good with numbers and timing, and this detail seemed important to her, though she couldn't quite put her finger on why. Most of the tropical diseases she had heard the doctors discuss seemed to develop symptoms much more quickly after exposure. Dr. Morrison spent over 2 hours examining Jonathan, conducting tests that were similar to what the previous doctors had done but with a focus on specific tropical diseases. He drew blood samples for specialized testing, examined Jonathan's skin for signs of unusual infections, and tested his reflexes and neurological responses for subtle signs of parasitic infections that might affect the nervous system. I'm going to send these blood samples to a laboratory in London that specializes in rare tropical diseases, Dr. Morrison explained to Eleanor as he packed up his equipment. They have testing capabilities that aren't available in most American laboratories, and they've identified infections that other facilities missed. It will take about 2 weeks to get the results back. After Dr. Morrison left, Margaret helped Jonathan settle back into bed for his afternoon rest. His condition seemed to be getting worse each week, and she was increasingly worried about his survival. She had cared for sick people before, but she had never seen someone deteriorate so steadily without any clear explanation for what was causing their illness. As Margaret went about her afternoon duties, cleaning the house and preparing dinner, she found herself thinking about the patterns she had observed in Jonathan's condition. She had always been detail-oriented. It was a trait that made her good at her job, but lately, she felt like she was noticing things that might be important. For instance, she had observed that Jonathan's symptoms seemed to follow a daily pattern. He was always worse in the mornings, often vomiting and complaining of severe headaches when he first woke up. His condition usually improved somewhat during the afternoon, only to worsen again in the evening. Margaret had mentioned this pattern to several of the doctors, but they hadn't seemed to think it was significant. She had also noticed that Jonathan's symptoms seemed to be worse after he spent time in certain parts of the house. His home office, where he often tried to work despite his illness, seemed to be particularly problematic. After spending even short periods in that room, Jonathan would emerge looking pale and nauseous, often needing to lie down immediately. Margaret had cleaned every inch of the Henderson mansion multiple times, and she was intimately familiar with every room. The house had been built only 5 years earlier with the finest materials and craftsmanship money could buy. Everything from the marble floors to the custom woodwork was of the highest quality, and the house had been featured in architectural magazines as an example of modern luxury. But, as Margaret thought about it more, she realized that Jonathan's office was one of the few rooms in the house that had been extensively renovated just before his illness began. Eleanor had wanted to surprise Jonathan with a completely redesigned workspace, and she had hired expensive interior designers to create what she called the perfect executive office. The renovation had included new custom cabinetry made from exotic woods, hand-painted wallpaper imported from France, and a collection of antique furniture pieces that Eleanor had acquired from estate sales around the world. The room had been completely gutted and rebuilt according to Eleanor's vision of what a successful businessman's office should look like. Margaret remembered that the renovation had been completed in January, just about a month before Jonathan first started complaining of headaches. She also recalled that Jonathan had been excited about the new office and had started spending more time there, often working late into the evening in his beautiful new workspace. As she thought about this timeline, Margaret began to wonder if there might be a connection between the office renovation and Jonathan's illness. She knew that some people were sensitive to chemicals used in new furniture and building materials, and she had heard of cases where people became sick from exposure to formaldehyde and other substances used in construction and manufacturing. But Margaret also knew that several doctors had already tested for chemical exposure, and they hadn't found anything dangerous. Dr. Santos, the toxicologist from Harvard, had specifically tested the air quality in Jonathan's office and hadn't detected any harmful chemicals. Margaret felt foolish for even thinking about it. If a Harvard toxicologist couldn't find anything wrong with the room, what could a housekeeper possibly notice that a trained scientist would miss? Still, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that there was something important about Jonathan's office. She decided to pay closer attention to that room during her cleaning routine, looking for anything that might seem unusual or out of place. The next morning, as Margaret was dusting Jonathan's office, she noticed something she hadn't paid attention to before. One of the antique pieces that Eleanor had purchased for the room was an ornate wooden desk set that included a large inkwell, several decorative boxes, and an elaborate pen holder. The pieces were beautifully crafted and appeared to be quite old, with intricate carvings and a rich, dark patina that spoke of age and quality. Margaret had dusted these pieces dozens of times over the past months, but today she looked at them more carefully. She noticed that the wood had an unusual sheen to it, almost as if it had been recently treated or polished with something. When she ran her cleaning cloth over the surface, she detected a faint, sweet smell that she hadn't noticed before. As Margaret continued cleaning, she found herself thinking about the desk set and wondering where Eleanor had acquired it. She knew that Eleanor often purchased antiques from estate sales and private dealers, and she wasn't always careful about verifying the provenance or condition of the pieces she bought. Margaret had seen Eleanor become excited about beautiful antiques and purchase them impulsively, sometimes without asking enough questions about their history or condition. Margaret decided to ask Eleanor about the desk set when she had a chance. She knew she had to be careful about how she approached the subject. Wealthy employers didn't always appreciate their housekeeping staff asking questions about their purchases, but she felt that the information might be important. Later that afternoon, when Eleanor was taking a break from sitting with Jonathan, Margaret approached her carefully. "Mrs. Henderson, I hope you don't mind me asking, but I was wondering about that beautiful desk set in Mr. Henderson's office. It's such an unusual piece, and I was curious about where you found it." Eleanor looked up from the magazine she had been pretending to read, her face showing the exhaustion that had become her constant companion. "Oh, that piece," she said, seeming to struggle to remember. "I bought it at an estate sale last December. It belonged to some old collector who had died, and his family was selling off his antique collection. The dealer said it was from the Victorian era and had come from England originally." Margaret nodded, trying to appear casually interested rather than concerned. "It's certainly beautiful. Did the dealer tell you anything else about its history or how it should be cared for?" Eleanor shrugged, her attention already drifting back to her worries about Jonathan. "Not really. He just said it was a rare piece, and that the wood was some kind of exotic hardwood that was very valuable. I thought it would look perfect in Jonathan's new office, and I was right. He loved it when he first saw it." As Margaret continued her work that day, she found herself thinking more about the desk set and its timing. Eleanor had purchased it in December, the renovation had been completed in January, and Jonathan's symptoms had begun in February. The timeline seemed too coincidental to ignore, but Margaret still wasn't sure what, if anything, it might mean. That evening, after helping Jonathan with his dinner and medications, Margaret decided to do some research of her own. She had basic computer skills and often used the internet to look up cleaning tips and household management advice. She decided to search for information about antique furniture and potential health risks. What Margaret found during her online search was both fascinating and alarming. She learned that some antique furniture, particularly pieces made in the 19th and early 20th centuries, had been treated with various chemicals and substances that were later discovered to be toxic. She read about pieces that had been painted with lead-based paints, treated with mercury-containing preservatives, or finished with shellacs and varnishes that contained harmful substances. More disturbing was what she learned about wood preservatives used in older furniture. Some antique pieces, particularly those that had been shipped internationally or stored in humid conditions, had been treated with arsenic-based preservatives to prevent insect damage and wood rot. These treatments were common in the Victorian era and early 1900s, when the health risks of arsenic exposure weren't fully understood. Margaret read several articles about cases where people had become sick from exposure to arsenic in antique furniture. The symptoms described in these articles, gradual onset of fatigue, headaches, nausea, weight loss, and neurological problems, sounded disturbingly similar to what Jonathan was experiencing. But Margaret also read that arsenic poisoning should be easily detectable through blood and urine tests, and she knew that Jonathan had been tested for heavy metal poisoning by several doctors. If arsenic was the culprit, surely one of the medical experts would have identified it by now. Still, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that she might be onto something important. She decided to pay even closer attention to Jonathan's office, and to the desk set in particular. She would look for any signs of deterioration, unusual smells, or other clues that might support her growing suspicion that the antique furniture might be connected to Jonathan's illness. Margaret also decided to keep a detailed journal of Jonathan's symptoms and activities, noting when he spent time in his office and how he felt afterward. She knew it wasn't her place to play detective, but she also knew that Jonathan was dying, and if there was even a small chance that she could help identify the cause of his illness, she had to try. The next morning brought news that seemed to confirm Margaret's worst fears. Dr. Morrison called with the results of his specialized testing for tropical diseases. Every test had come back negative. Jonathan didn't have malaria, sleeping sickness, schistosomiasis, or any of the other exotic infections that Dr. Morrison had suspected. Eleanor broke down crying when she heard the news. 15 doctors had now examined Jonathan, and none of them could explain what was killing him. His condition continued to worsen, and the medical experts seemed to be running out of ideas. Some were beginning to suggest that Jonathan might have an entirely new disease that had never been identified before, while others were starting to hint that his condition might be untreatable. Margaret watched Eleanor's despair with a heavy heart, but she was more determined than ever to investigate her suspicions about the office furniture. She had learned enough about arsenic poisoning to know that it could sometimes be difficult to detect, especially if the exposure was chronic and at relatively low levels. She also knew that different types of arsenic compounds could affect the body in different ways, and some forms might not show up on standard toxicology tests. That afternoon, while Jonathan was sleeping and Eleanor was meeting with attorneys about business matters, Margaret decided to examine the desk set more closely. She put on rubber gloves and began looking at every surface of the antique pieces, searching for signs of deterioration, powder, or anything else that might indicate the presence of toxic substances. What she found made her heart race. On the underside of one of the decorative boxes, she discovered a small area where the wood finish was flaking away, revealing a whitish, powdery substance underneath. The powder had a slight crystalline appearance, and when Margaret accidentally breathed in a small amount, she immediately tasted the same metallic flavor that Jonathan had been complaining about for months. Margaret carefully collected a small sample of the powder in a plastic bag, being careful not to inhale any more of it. She knew that she was probably overstepping her bounds as a housekeeper, but she also knew that this discovery might be the key to saving Jonathan's life. The question now was how to get the powder tested and how to convince the medical experts that a housekeeper had found something that 15 doctors had missed. As Margaret continued her work in the household, she couldn't help but notice patterns that seemed to escape the medical experts. She observed that Jonathan's condition seemed to follow a rhythm that correlated with his daily activities and the places where he spent his time. She also noticed that certain objects and areas in the house seemed to be associated with his worst symptoms. But Margaret was just a housekeeper, and she knew that wealthy families didn't typically seek medical advice from their domestic staff. She continued to do her job, keeping the house clean and helping to care for Jonathan, while watching the parade of medical experts come and go without finding answers. The 15th doctor was already being contacted, and Margaret wondered how many more specialists would examine Jonathan before someone finally discovered what was making him sick. The mystery of Jonathan Henderson's illness was about to enter a new phase, one that would challenge everything the medical experts thought they knew about diagnosis and treatment. And Margaret Williams, with her careful observations and practical wisdom, was about to play a role that no one could have predicted.